with Make Nevada and Make Alaska, and I am continuing my program for one moment actually. Hello, it's Amanda with Make Alaska, and I'm live streaming Make Nevada. I am going through Northwestern University's free online nonprofit course. We've already done Governance Fundamentals, which was 8 videos. Now we're working on Your Role, which is 7 videos. And we need to go back to Your Role. We have 1, 2, now 3. Oh, we've actually done 3 videos. 3. Now we're on the 4th video. How to structure effective board meetings. Learn how to structure effective, engaging, and inspirational board meetings. Applied thinking. As you watch the video, consider the following. As you consider how to have more dynamic discussions at your board meetings, brainstorm some questions that you can ask during the meeting that can lead to more interesting and relevant conversations. And you know me, I like to speed it up. Let's try just 1 point. Let's try 1.5. See how that sounds. There we go.
Hello, my name is Allie Henry. I'm a clinical assistant professor of social impact and director of the Bell Capital Board Fellows program here at Kellogg. Just like
I'll put it down to 1.25. And if you want to watch the course yourself, I'll put the link in the description so that you can go to their website and watch it yourself. And if you want to watch this video, which will be better quality than this, I'll put the link also in the description box. Here we go.
a good story, a board meeting needs a hook to kick things off, a dynamic middle, and a conclusive ending. How can you create that hook in the beginning? One way is to kick off your meeting with a mission moment. Consider reserving 5 to 10 minutes after you kick off the meeting and check for quorum to engage in an activity or a shared experience that reminds everyone why they're there. Board members are volunteers and have busy lives outside of their board service, and most don't think about the organization every day. A mission moment centers everyone in the room on why they're there, dedicating their time to this organization. You might consider inviting program participants to visit the board meeting and share their experience. You can invite frontline staff to visit the board meeting to share a day in the life. You could preview the gala video together in advance of the event. The goal of a mission moment is to anchor everyone on the shared vision they are there to advance. This can be both a motivating force for individuals and an aligning mechanism for the group. From there, you can pass your consent agenda and then come to the meat of the meeting. How do you create a dynamic discussion in your board meeting? Lack of strategic discussion is the biggest complaint I hear from board members. They wish their boards could move away from report outs. They crave discussion. They crave a real reason for being in the boardroom. If so many boards want this type of meeting, then why is it so rare? Well, in my observation, there are 3 common obstacles: the agenda, the culture, and the people. The good news is you can do something about each of those. First, you can change your agenda. This is the easiest adjustment you can make. Instead of listing each committee on the agenda, reserve an hour of the meeting for discussion of a strategic challenge, opportunity, or question. All committee updates and any related votes can live in the pre-read and the consent agenda. If something requires discussion by the full board, then it can be pulled into the discussion section. Ask yourself, what requires input from multiple board committees? And what persistent challenges or risks on the horizon might we solve faster if we heard from multiple perspectives? These are the items that should be prioritized for the discussion portion of the agenda. And whose job is it to change the agenda? Well, the agenda is set by the board chair in collaboration with the CEO. If you are in one of those roles, the ruby slippers are on your feet. You have the power. And if not, now you know who to forward this video to. Second, you can change your culture. A culture of engagement is one where board members actively listen, ask questions, and share their perspectives, time, and resources. The fastest way to create this culture is to model the behavior you want to see. Find allies who share your desire to shift the board's behavior. People most often refrain from asking questions because they're afraid. Afraid of asking a question everyone else knows the answer to, afraid that their question will reveal that they weren't prepared for the meeting, afraid the question will derail the meeting in a direction no one else thinks is important. The reality is, most questions are not unique. If you are thinking it, chances are someone else on the board is too. So be brave, model curiosity and courage. Ask the question and start the discussion. It is everyone's job to make the meeting dynamic, relevant, and meaningful. Third, and as a last resort, you can change the people around the table. Sometimes you encounter a board that has fallen into toxic patterns and lacks the will to change. If, despite your best efforts, your board still has members who are not engaged, not prepared to discuss the topics at hand, and not responsive, then it's time to have some hard conversations. In the board chair's annual meeting with each board member, they can have a frank discussion about whether this role is still the right fit for them at this time. This gives each board member the opportunity to recommit or gracefully end their board service. Sometimes changing the composition of your board is the only way to ensure the table is full of people who are up to the task. Now, back to the flow of the meeting. When you wrap up the discussion section, the CEO can then share an executive update. This can be treated as a State of the Union, an outline of priorities heading into the next period, defining current needs, sharing gratitude and shout-outs, and making specific asks of the board. This should be a prioritized set of updates that lasts 20 to 30 minutes. Finally, the CEO and any other staff members should leave the room so the board can hold executive session. This is an opportunity for board members to raise any questions or concerns that aren't relevant or appropriate to discuss in front of staff. Typical items include the CEO's performance and compensation, board-specific items, and any other relevant topics board members wish to bring to the group's attention. Even if there's no known topic, it's still healthy for boards to hold this time in each meeting so they're in the practice of it if and when the need arises. So to recap, a mission moment will give you your hook, the dynamic middle will come from a fresh agenda and a courageous, engaged culture, and the executive session will bring the meeting to a conclusive ending. Just like the great story, if you give a mouse a cookie, if you give a board a better agenda, then the board will participate more actively. And if the board actively participates, then board members will feel more engaged. If board members feel more engaged, then the organization will benefit from the full energy, passion, and support of this important group of stakeholders. The ending may not be as satisfying as the chocolate chip cookie in the original story, but you have the power to make your meetings more effective. Use it.
I am watching Northwestern University's free online nonprofit course about nonprofit boards. So I'm just sharing the information, and maybe people want to listen along and learn. Going back to your role, and we are now on the 5th of 7 videos of this segment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3 tactics for efficient board meetings. Learn how to make the most of your board meetings with practical and tactical strategies. So the reason why this is important is because nonprofits are ran by a board. Yes, they have an executive director who is kind of like an operations manager who runs the day-to-day, but the overall big picture is ran by your board of directors. So it's very important that the board of directors operates in a healthy, effective, efficient, productive manner. Applied thinking. As you watch the video, consider the following. The professor in the video shares several easily implemented tactics that you can use to make your board meetings more efficient and effective. Are you currently using any of these tactics? And if not, what can you try at your next meeting? Did I have her at 1.25 or 1.5? I think 125. Here we go. Hi, Ahmed.
Hello, my name is Allie Henry. I'm a clinical assistant professor of social impact and director of the Golub Capital Board Fellows program here at Kellogg. Many say a person's most precious resource is not money or status, but time. The world is full of demands on our time. bids for our attention. Even when we've chosen to do one thing, our brains think about all the other things we could or should be doing instead. The truth is, being a board member takes time. When we step into a meeting, we want to know that our time will be well spent. This video offers tactical guidance on how to make the most of your board meetings. This matters not only because we are all busy, but because when people feel their time is well spent, they feel respected, which in turn makes them feel valued and thus more engaged. So, how can you be efficient with your time in a board meeting? I will share 3 specific strategies. Send and expect people to read materials in advance, use a consent agenda, and follow Robert's Rules of Order, or another procedural mechanism of your choosing. So first, send and expect people to read materials in advance. A few years ago, I led a training session for a 12-person board. In the Q&A at the end, one of the board members raised her hand and politely said, "There's a lot to read before each meeting. Can we allocate the first hour of the meeting to reading the materials?" I kept the surprise off my face, but could hardly believe my ears. No, board members must come to the meeting prepared and ready to engage. If you are on a board that doesn't come prepared, then one of 2 things might be happening. The materials really might be too long. I've seen board books that are 200 plus pages long sent out just a few days before the meeting. That is overwhelming. If this describes your board, consider requesting an executive summary instead. Suggest that some materials be moved to an appendix, to be viewed only if there are additional questions, or ask that the board chair or executive director tell you what needs to be reviewed in detail and what you can simply skim. If the materials are fine, but board members still arrive unprepared, then they may have been unintentionally trained not to read the materials. Have you ever been to a meeting where the slides were read word for word, or when the materials you reviewed in advance were presented again in the meeting? I have, and boy is it painful. It makes me feel anxious and annoyed. To avoid those negative feelings, you and others on your board might choose not to prepare next time because you know it would be a waste of time. To correct a situation like this, you could suggest reorganizing the meeting agenda. The board chair could structure the meeting around a set of questions rather than reports. Whatever you do, definitely don't read the slides or memos out loud in the meeting. Once your board comes prepared and ready to engage, then you can introduce strategy number 2, a consent agenda. A consent agenda is a meeting agenda item that groups routine, non-controversial items together for a single vote or action. This agenda item typically comes at the beginning of the meeting and includes such items as approving prior board meeting minutes, committee meeting minutes, and new board member approvals, to name a few. By voting once on this group of items, you spend less time on procedures and more time in discussion. This strategy can work well for boards of all sizes and stages. To make a consent agenda work, the board must receive relevant documentation well in advance of the meeting. 1 week is typical. The board also must receive guidance on where to direct questions if they have any. Ideally, board members can resolve any concerns in advance of the meeting by directing questions to the chair. If not, then board members can request in advance or in the meeting that an item be removed from the consent agenda for further discussion at a later date. This type of procedural improvement can be extended to the entire meeting with strategy number 3, Robert's Rules of Order. First, let me note that many small boards find Robert's Rules to be too formal. I completely understand that. The intent of parliamentary procedure, though, is to maintain order and ensure fairness in all decision-making processes, and that is something that organizations of all sizes can.
If you're not familiar with Robert's Rules of Order, that is like when in a meeting someone says, I vote to approve the minutes. All in order, all in favor, say aye, aye, and then you take a head count. All who do not approve, say nay, nay. You take a head count, and then you say, etc., etc. But that's Rules of Order.
Aspire to. Here are a few procedural elements that all boards have in common and that drive greater efficiency and equity. First, a quorum must be present. The Latin word quorum means of them, as in how many of them are there. In a board context, quorum is the minimum number of members required for the board to conduct business, and this number is defined in a board's bylaws. If quorum is not achieved, then the board must reschedule the meeting or adjourn until quorum is met. Second, someone must lead the meeting and someone must take notes. Meetings should be led by the board chair, not the CEO or executive director, and minutes should be taken by the board secretary. Third, votes occur on important decisions. In classroom simulations, I often see new board members unsure about how to vote. I also see them vote far too often. The process of voting can really bog down a meeting. As noted earlier, a consent agenda helps streamline the voting process. If you opt not to use a consent agenda, be clear up front about which agenda items will require a vote and which will not. When it's time to vote, here's how to do it. Let's say I'm on a board that's considering buying a new facility. To propose that vote, I say, I move that we buy building A. Another board member needs to second the motion. Once seconded, the chair asks, is there any discussion? This is the time for board members to advocate for the motion, raise questions, or voice concerns. Once discussion ends, the chair calls for the vote. All in favor say aye, all opposed say nay or no. Voting can also happen by a show of hands or by private written ballot, though this is rare. The chair then announces the count and the decision before moving on to the next agenda item. This content may feel tactical and in the weeds. It is by design. Send and expect people to read materials in advance, use a consent agenda, set and follow procedural rules. These things matter because they directly contribute to how efficient your board meetings are, and thus how respected and valued your board members feel, which ultimately leads to how engaged your board is likely to become.
Something I'll say is I was reading the state of Alaska nonprofit rules per the government on their website, and it has things in there about quorum and how you have to have a majority and whatnot. And another thing that's important is that even though it might seem a little formal and maybe everyone's getting along and the board meetings have been very calm and cooperative, they are until they're not. And issues will arise at some point. There will be disagreements on what decisions are being made or how money is being spent or what results are being achieved. So when the time comes when things are not going smoothly, it's really important that the habit of the parliamentary rules are in order. Now we are going to go to the fifth. Is this the fifth? Hold on, I think we might be on. We've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now we're on the sixth of 7. That was 7 videos. Yes. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, so she just so we're on 6. Learning from common board member pitfalls. Identify common mistakes board members can make and the implication these mistakes can have on the work of the organization. I want to go on a little side quest real quick, and I want to show you this little time game. Oops, calculator. Where's the calculator? This is why it's so important to be efficient with time. All right, let's say that there's a board meeting every month and 15 minutes is wasted every month. That's 3 hours. That's 3 hours. So here's another one. Let's say you waste 5 minutes an hour out of an 8-hour workday times 5 days a week. Let's say you take a vacation, it's time 50 weeks. Holy crap. That's 166 wasted hours. Did I do that right? Hold on a second. 5 minutes times 8 hours times 5 days times 50 weeks. These are minutes times 60 minutes for hours. Yeah, 166 hours divided by a 40-hour work week. So you've wasted, if you waste 5 minutes an hour every day of your 5-day work week, you've wasted 4 weeks, over 4 weeks a year. That's why it's important to be efficient. Okay, learning from common board member pitfalls. Applied thinking. As you watch the video, consider the following. What common pitfalls resonate with you, and have you seen any of these in action? How can you support the CEO, executive director, and the board chair to help ensure these common mistakes don't happen?
Hi, I'm Allie Henry, a clinical assistant professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University and director of the Gallup Capital Board Fellows Program. In these series of videos, you find information and good practices that can help you know what to do if you find yourself in the role of board member. This video is a bit of a departure. It is a discussion of what not to do as a board member. Here are some common prototypes to avoid. First is what I call the care bearer. This is the person in the boardroom who cares so much about the mission that their passion becomes weaponized. Sometimes this looks like a board member who so passionately defends their opinion that they burst into tears, making it uncomfortable for anyone else to disagree. Sometimes this looks like a board member who finds a way to bring every conversation back to their pet project again and again, to the detriment of the rest of the board's business. Sometimes this looks like a board member who makes irrational decisions because they are emotionally tied to a certain program, approach, or person. Please note that passion for the mission is necessary, but not sufficient. You must be able to check your own baggage. To fulfill your duty of care, you must act as an ordinary, prudent person. So, only become a board member if you are willing to behave like one. The second prototype is what we'll call the watchdog. This is the person in the boardroom who believes nonprofit staff cannot be trusted, and it is their job to prove it. This most often looks like a board member interrupting or talking over staff, using an accusatory tone when sharing an opinion, and undercutting staff in front of the board. But let's remember, oversight is part of a board's responsibilities. It is appropriate for the board to ask questions and serve as a check and balance to staff leadership. We also remember that the board has one employee, the CEO, so it is appropriate to ask questions of that person. Yet we must do so while also remembering that the CEO is in a lonely role. They sit at an intersection between board and staff. As board members, we must avoid passive-aggressive behavior and engage instead in open, trust-building communication, while also establishing sufficient internal controls and policies. Third, the cost cutters. These are the people who believe non-program.
Before we go on, let's talk about the watchdog with the executive director, the CEO, the person who runs the day-to-day operation. So that position can be, I was in that position can be very frustrating because you're the person who's there. During COVID, I worked every single day for like 12 hours a day for about maybe 9 months. So the person who's running the day-to-day operations, they understand the ins and outs. They understand, the leaky faucet, the broken wheelbarrow, whatever. They understand everything. And then when you go to a board meeting, you might have board members that haven't been at the actual nonprofit in a month or more. They don't know what's going on day to day, and they're making these big picture decisions, and the person who is there day to day might get very frustrated that those big decisions, big picture decisions, aren't rational to what the reality is. So, but that's why the board of directors exists, because they need to make sure that the big picture mission stays the objective, because the person who is there on a day-to-day basis can get lost in the weeds, because I've also been a board member who, oversaw the executive director. Now let's go back to the cost cutters.
Expenses are to be avoided at all costs, pun intended. First, a quick refresher. There are 3 categories of nonprofit expenses: program, fundraising, and administrative. Program expenses are all expenses directly connected to mission-related activities. Think of teacher salaries, classroom supplies, etc. Fundraising expenses are what it costs to raise money. These are the development director salaries, event costs, etc. And third, the administrative expenses are everything else: CEO salary, electricity, printers, etc. Together, fundraising and admin expenses are commonly referred to as overhead. So now back to the cost cutters. You'll often hear these board members reminding the group that we need to minimize overhead, lower cost per student, or increase the percent spent on programs. Having grown up in a frugal household and having turned around a near bankrupt nonprofit, I have great respect for the need to be cost conscious. However, a singular focus on cost reduction starves nonprofits of the resources they need to succeed. The nonprofit consulting firm Bridgespan has done a terrific amount of research on the nonprofit starvation cycle, if you want more on that. Fourth, we have the money bags. These board members give a check, but don't engage. They don't attend meetings, they don't weigh in on important decisions. On the surface, this may not seem like a problem. The nonprofit needs money, and this board member is making a significant contribution. This situation, though, in some cases can lead to big problems. This board member's lack of engagement exacerbates an unhealthy power dynamic. It sets an example that board members are not all required to fulfill the same set of responsibilities. It puts a burden on the other board members to carry the business of the board. And it usually signals that the CEO and other board members are not comfortable holding that board member accountable because they are afraid of losing that person's money. Consider whether this person can exist as a high-tier donor instead. There is no rule that major donors must serve as board members, especially if they are unwilling to do the work of being a board member. Finally, we have the resume builders. These are the people who are in the boardroom because, and only because, they want to be in the same room as the other board members. Beware. This is a dangerous type of board member. You don't have to look far to find power boards whose organizations have unexpectedly failed. They did not fail for lack of expertise on the board. They failed in part due to lack of attention from those on the board. It's true that being on a board is a great way to meet people, expand your network, and build your professional community. But the networking potential of a board must be in the nice-to-have part of your decision matrix. Remember, by joining a board, you are committing to the duty of loyalty, which means you agree to put the organization's interests first. Be honest with yourself. Are you joining the board to support the mission or for personal gain? If the answer is only the latter, then you should not join the board. In summary, we do not want to be any of these prototypes, but we can take lessons from each. From the Care Bear, we learned that we should care enough, but not so much that it clouds our judgment. From the Watchdog, we learned that we should ask questions, but do so in a respectful, trust-building way. From the Cost Cutters, we learned that we should pay attention to expenses, but invest to build capacity. And from the Money Bags, we learned that we should contribute financially, but also engage in the work of the board. Finally, from the Resume Builders, we learned that we should benefit from the networking opportunities on our boards, but not lose sight of the real reason we're in the room. Do you recognize any of these prototype board members on your board? Are you one of these prototype board members? We hope that by shining a light on these bad behaviors, we can prompt healthy dialogue and inspire better board member behavior.
All right, back to your roll, and it might be the very last one. Let's see. All right, inclusive board practices. Explore best practices to ensure all voices are heard around the board table, including how to foster inclusive discussions during meetings and approach governance with a commitment to transparency and shared decision making. Applied thinking. As you watch the video, consider the following. What inclusive practices have you employed in your professional roles? Can they apply to nonprofit board service? Why or why not?
Hello, I'm Cedric Thurman, Executive Vice President at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago. I'm here today to talk to you about a couple of questions related to not-for-profit board essentials. So let's jump right in. The first question we're going to address today is, how can board members and boards collectively be more inclusive of diverse voices in meetings and or discussions? Then the second question we're going to address is, how can boards have a DEI lens on all aspects of governance, transparency, decision-making rights, retention? But before we answer those questions, you're going to have to think about where do you begin as you're trying to answer those questions. There are four things I want you to keep in mind during this discussion. Do you know the culture of your board? Every organization, every group of people has a culture. Do you know that for your board? How are board members selected? That's going to become important as we talk through this. How are board members onboarded? It's more than just bringing them onto the board. How do you actually onboard them into board culture, into the organization itself? And does representation of the board reflect the organization's mission and who the organization serves? Keep those four things in mind as we talk today. So let's jump into the first question. How can board members and boards collectively be more inclusive of diverse voices in meetings or discussions? Let's start with individual board members. Active listening. Now, this sounds simple. Everybody says they're an active listener.
So they've had this video in a different segment, so I'm already a little familiar with it. I will say that he's not talking about DEI strictly as it pertains to, having different races, ages, genders, etc. on the board. He's talking, the way I perceive it, he's talking more about making sure that dominant voices let less dominant voices speak. So, as we all know, in group environments, you're going to have your alpha or wannabe alpha dogs that try to hog the conversation, and then you're going to have your more shy, reserved people who don't speak up. And so think about it more from that perspective as we move forward. And that's really important to me. Having served on a board for 5 years, is that I definitely saw that. Not necessarily that there was alphas, but that there's these quiet people who don't um, speak up, and we need to make sure that their opinions and thoughts are heard because there's a reason why they're there. Their intellect and experience is the treasure that we need to pillage.
The challenge is when you go to board meetings, there are always dominant voices in a room.
See?
Not for profit boards, for profit boards, any meeting, any committee, there are always dominant voices. It's really important that you're listening to all the voices.
Sure. Number 2 with fries. Yes, I will go live. And
Especially
let's
those
chat
who might
later
be
so I
less
can
vocal in
finish
the room.
this.
How do you make sure you're engaging them? Encourage participation. Invite all participants to speak, particularly those from underrepresented groups. Underrepresented groups will have different meaning depending on your organization. For example, you may be an organization thinking about breast cancer, and there are a lot of women on your board. The underrepresented population may be the male voice in the room. Are you listening to that perspective by chance? Be mindful of bias. People say, I don't have biases. Everybody likes to believe they don't have them. That's not true. We all have biases. It's the way our brains work. We all have biases. But those biases will impact who you call on in a meeting, who you listen to in a meeting, and sometimes who you won't listen to in a meeting. So be mindful of your bias because it could guide who you call on for different perspectives. You may call on the CFO because you're talking about something related to the budgeting, but maybe the marketing
CFO, Chief Financial Officer.
person has a really good input that they want to provide, but your bias says you don't call on them regularly. Mentorship. A lot of times people think, I brought somebody onto the board, they're successful, they're talented, they don't necessarily need a mentor. But your board is new and potentially different for them. Maybe it's their first board. Maybe it's the first time they served on a not-for-profit board. Mentorship is really important because going back to what I said earlier, boards have a culture. That mentorship is important because it helps people understand board culture and how do you onboard them. They need to understand how do you fit into the board. Most people, when they join organizations or boards, they're slow to work in their conversation because they're trying to learn and understand. The mentorship helps them understand how they can bring their voice to that table. Let's talk about boards collectively. Diverse recruitment. Diverse recruitment, again, the example I gave earlier was maybe it's an organization looking at breast cancer and you have men on the board. And so sometimes people think, why do we need a male voice in that conversation? Men get breast cancer too. Maybe.
So I'll stop right here. For an example relating to the nonprofit that I am creating, um, that is based around animals, one day the ultimate goal would be to have an animal sanctuary. And with an animal sanctuary, there is a lot of the building and maintaining of animal habitats, pens, cages, etc. And so having somebody who has a construction background, even though they might not know anything about animals, that would be a top priority for me. Uh, Construction, um, plumbing, because you want to get the water. There's these really unique ways that you can do water systems to be really efficient with the watering of the animals, all that jazz. So someone might not think, oh, well, I work in construction. Why would I be on the board of directors for an animal nonprofit? Yeah, trust me, buddy, you'd be very, very, very useful. Somebody who knows a lot about websites, search engine optimization, AI, yada, yada, yada. That's super important in our digital age, right?
You want somebody who has a lived experience there. And so, how do you think about that? So, diverse recruitment is not just gender, race, or age or professional background. That's important. But there are a lot of ways you've got to think about, again, the mission of the organization. And do you have enough diverse voices in the room to help you solve the mission of the organization that you're there? An inclusive agenda. This always sounds very simple because people say our agenda is very inclusive. Not necessarily sometimes when you take a step back. Are you allowing time for everyone to contribute? Are you allowing time for topics to hit the agenda where people can say, have we thought about this? Have we talked about that? You've got to be very inclusive in just the agenda itself because it can influence who's going to contribute in a meeting and who's not going to contribute in a meeting. Training and development. We're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Does the board go through any training on diversity, equity, and inclusion? A lot of times people say, oh, I get that at my job, or I get that in another environment, or I understand all those issues. I don't necessarily have to be trained on it. But depending on the mission of the organization, because again, we're talking about not-for-profits, diversity, equity, inclusion training can be critically important for board members because you're serving constituencies that you may not have the same lived experiences they have. So that training can help you understand how you better relate to those with that lived experience that you're serving.
The way that that could apply to the animal sector is that um, different cultures are different cultures have different approaches to animals. So it's really important, for example, for a city person who has only had indoor pets to be open to understanding the perspective of a rural person that might have outdoor working cats. The city person might think, oh, that's absolutely crazy. You can't let your cat be an outdoor cat. Well, working cats for people who have rural properties is very, very important. It is a natural rodent and pest mitigation program that's been used ever since we've been domesticating cats. I kind of think that's why they even domesticated cats. Wasn't it the Egyptians that they domesticated this small desert wild cat so that the cat would eat the rats out of the grain storage? I think that might have been. Now I want to look it up later.
On a daily basis. Feedback mechanisms. Are there ways for you to get input from your board members? Again, you have an agenda, you're talking about topics, but do you know it's really working for everybody? How do you get that feedback? Sometimes board chairs will say, I meet with people individually to get their feedback. They're generally going to tell you what you want to hear as the board chair. So do you have anonymous feedback mechanisms? So somebody can say, person A is dominant in the room, they don't leave space for others. They may not tell that to a board chair, but with anonymous feedback, they will say that information, which becomes helpful for you to figure out how you engage others in the process. Rotate roles. You want to make sure that there's normally a board chair or a vice chair or committee chairs and things of that nature. But what does succession planning look like? So all of those roles rotate around because the more you can rotate the roles, it helps with that onboarding that I spoke about earlier. So people realize there will be the opportunity for me to serve differently in this organization. And when I can serve differently, I learn more about the organization. When I learn more about the organization, I can contribute differently to the organization. So rotate roles. How can boards have a DEI lens in all aspects of governance? Transparency, decision-making rights, retention. Let's start with transparency. Open communication. As we've talked about earlier, you've got to make sure that you're getting information from everybody in the room. But you also want to make sure you're sharing information related to the mission. So if you're focused on things related to DEI, are you sharing goals? Are you sharing progress against those goals? Any challenge you're having to success? But information that helps people understand this is our mission, this is how we're trying to accomplish it. But are we sharing that information and creating conversation around it? Not just sharing it for people to see and read. Are you creating conversation and dialogue around it? The dialogue engages people and creates that environment where open communication can happen. Inclusive reporting. One of the things you don't want to do is make sure you're keeping things under the vest and people don't understand what's happening and don't know what's going on. You want to have that reporting include all the things that are important and you're getting diverse perspectives and experience in there. I talked about those lived experiences. That's one of the ways that you're making sure you're getting that reporting out. If you have people with lived experiences, helping share how the mission of the organization is impacting them or other things they need so the mission of the organization can positively impact them. That's part of that inclusive reporting. Data transparency. We all know data is important. We all know people what measures gets done. But are you making sure that the data you're collecting connects to the mission of the organization and has a positive impact on those lived experiences of the people you're trying to serve? That data transparency becomes critically important because, again, it contributes to engagement, it contributes to communication, it contributes to people wanting to serve on your board. So as you go to recruit board members, you have a stable of people who want to be in the room as opposed to you trying to convince somebody to be in the room. Let's talk about decision rights. Diverse committees. Are you making sure that, again, if it's the finance committee, is everybody on the finance committee an accountant, a CFO, or a treasurer? Or are you making sure that the committees themselves have diverse perspectives? You want to make sure that people who are serving on the board don't get pigeonholed to doing what they do every single day. They may have other board experiences that they can add value to things that don't naturally seem like they have that background. So how are you thinking about committee structures, who's leading committees, and the conversations that are happening there? Equitable participation. Again, sounds simple, sounds logical to a lot of people, but this ensures all of your board members feel like they have the opportunity to participate and contribute. So if you're creating an environment where there's open communication, you're creating an environment where there's transparency in data, you're going to help contribute to equitable participation. Don't assume you do one of these things, all of them happen. You have to be very intentional in making sure all of these things happen concurrently. And then bias training. We talked earlier about bias. Everybody thinks they don't have it, but we all have it. There's nothing wrong with that. We just need to recognize we have it, but then you also have to do training on bias. There's conscious bias and unconscious bias, but we need to make sure we're training people on it because there's subtle ways that we don't sometimes realize the ways in which our bias decides who we're going to, again, call on at a meeting, not call on a meeting, who we think is a good board member, who we don't want to invite to a board. That bias can come into play, and so we need to do training on that. Retention. We want to create an inclusive culture. If we're bringing people to our board, we want them to be on our board. We want them to tell others about our board. We want them to tell others about our organization and the mission of the organization. If you're creating an inclusive culture, then that way your board members feel like they can add value. You want to foster that culture where they feel like they can bring all of the things themselves to that meeting. If they sit on multiple other boards, maybe they're hearing things in those other boards that could be valuable to this board. And so that you want them to be able to share that there. Or maybe they're hearing things to say, I saw this in another board. We're not doing that. Why don't we do that? That inclusive culture helps bring that information in. Mentorship programs. We talked about this earlier. Mentorship is critically important. As I said earlier, when you got to think about how do people get to your board? What's the culture of your board? How do you onboard people into your board? Those things people can sometimes take for granted. But that participation is going to be critical. And so you've got to think through, how do I make sure somebody understands the culture of our board, how they were selected, why they were selected, what do we expect them to be able to do in these meetings? That mentorship will allow all of that information to get shared and get people in the organization set up correctly to be a successful board member. And then again, feedback mechanisms. You need to make sure that you're getting information back from your board members so they understand how they can address the mission of the organization, how they can contribute and add value back. That feedback is critically important because as you do all of these things collectively, you want to make sure that, again, your board members are saying, this is valuable. I feel like I can contribute. I can feel like I can add value to the mission of the organization. Those feedback mechanisms are critically important. Thank you for your time today. Hope you learned something. Hopefully you can apply this to your not-for-profit board. And hopefully the mission of those organizations becomes very successful because you found a way to be a very valuable board member and a very valuable board. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, so that was all 7 videos, just double checking, for this portion of Northwestern University's free online nonprofit course. And yep, that's it. So that's going to be all for this little series, and then I'll start next time on board structure. Have a great day. Bye.